because so often adaptation is, the whole notion that we have to make changes. It's a crisis of imagination. We can't imagine what's going to happen to us, and we can't imagine what we ought to do to deal with it. I do want to mention one of the things that Peter Carter has said to me several times is that we really need to be talking about adaptation measures that are also mitigation measures.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Emergency Forum. I'm your host, Regina Valdez, and tonight we're going to be talking about adaptation opportunities. And when we talk about climate change and we talk about the effects of climate change, we often talk about two aspects. We talk about mitigation and adaptation. So when we're speaking about mitigation, we're talking about mitigating those externalities, those external factors that hasten or bring about climate change. For example, drawing down carbon dioxide or methane emissions. When we talk about adaptation, we talk about how we're going to adapt to the changing planet. And we really need both of these. We need to bring down these greenhouse emissions. We have to. But knowing that we've already got warming baked in the pie, so to speak, we're going to have effects. We're going to have drier weather in certain parts of the planet. We're going to have wetter weather in certain parts of the planet. We're going to have sea level rise. So these are the things that we need to adapt to. And if we don't adapt, there's going to be serious trouble afoot. Serious trouble indeed. What does a place like Bangladesh do when continually being flooded? If you don't adapt, you die. Okay, and this is just the fact of it. And then just speaking a little bit more about adaptation, there are these, what we call the CIS, the small island states or small island nations. In particular, Tuvalu is often spoken about. They're facing a great threat from sea level rise. I think it's something by 2050, or 50% of the island is going to be underwater. They're facing something, an existential crisis. So in terms of adaptation, there are people who are planting mangroves, seagrasses, these type of things that will help soak up the water and prevent erosion. But to be quite frank, that's good, but it's not enough. So in the case of a place such as Tuvalu, for example, what they're considering doing is dredging one of their main rivers and using the sand to actually physically raise the island. So they are going to raise the island bit by bit, starting from out in, while on island, and hoping to raise it 6 feet. So what is the idea of that? The idea of that is that will buy time until more technology regarding sea level rise and how to adapt to it can be more sophisticated. But this is a start. It's a very creative idea, and there are many, many others like it. And we have to start thinking this way, not just, oh my God, this is terrible, but what can we do? And we have to realize these aren't perfect solutions. But we got to take a solution and hope that people are studying enough and paying attention enough, and the brightest minds in this world will come in 10 to 15 years and say there's other ways for us to deal with sea level rise. Of course, there's so many aspects to the changes that we're going to be seeing, and I'm going to punt it over to you, Paul, because I want to hear some of the creative and awesome ideas that you can share with us about adaptation.
Yes, thank you, Regina. So there's lots of elements that we can discuss today. There's numerous things that people can try to do to adjust their lives and their situations to the climate change that is already built into the system. So hazards from climate change are getting worse, as we know. There's a lot more wildfires, there's torrential rains leading to floods, there's droughts, there's high winds. There's lots more tropical storms because the oceans are a lot warmer. So there's all of these different hazards that are increasing. We really need to educate people as to what hazards they may face in the particular region that they live in. And this involves looking at, I guess you'd call them vulnerability studies, finding the weakest points. Is it the power grid? Is it the type of structures that their houses are made of, the materials? Is it where they're located, a coastal village or a coastal town? And then what sort of response services do we have set up for when the hazard strikes? How long will the power be off? What sort of hospital and ambulance and paramedic services do we have? And of course, planning ahead and anticipating these events is also vital for allowing for a decent and timely response. So let me talk about some specifics, for example. So if you live in an area where there's lots of forests around and you get periodic droughts, and obviously, these forests can dry out, and a spark or some lightning or a careless match thrown can trigger a wildfire. And when you combine that with high winds, a whole town can be destroyed very, very quickly. And we've seen this. I remember Paradise in California, remember Lytton in BC. These things can happen extremely quickly. So how do we mitigate against things like that? Well, one of the things is we need to change building codes so that they are strengthened and reinforced and provide some sort of way to reduce the hazard. For example, if you're in a wildfire region, it makes no sense to have asphalt shingles on your roof or cedar wood roof, because ashes and sparks can set your whole place on fire. So just use a metal roof. Make sure that you use hurricane strapping, so there's extra straps, and houses can be retrofit so that the roof stays on with high winds and is not and won't catch fire with wildfires. So adaptation to hazards can be done at all different levels. It's not just at the levels of the federal governments. It's also in provinces or states, also in cities, also you as an individual house owner. And if you're in an area where there's torrential rains and floods, obviously you need to improve drainage around your house. Make sure that there's places for the water to go. You can have green roofs to absorb some of the rainwater. You can have good grading around your house so that all of the ground is sloping away from the house to carry the water away. You can have eaves trough, which direct the water long distances away from your house. So you basically, if you're in a flood-prone region, then you can elevate your house on stilts. It's possible to jack up an entire house and elevate it that way, as people did along the Ottawa River, for example, after there were 2 record floods. Building codes are just not good enough right now. We just had Hurricane Fiona go through the Maritimes, and the winds weren't at their fiercest when this crossed Prince Edward Island after going ashore in Nova Scotia. And lots of houses on the North Shore, cottages were pushed off their foundations, etc., because they're just not built for these conditions. So hopefully when things are rebuilt, they can be done in a much more secure and solid way to withstand these type of extreme weather conditions that we're seeing more and more often now. The worst case, you move away. From, if you're right on the coast and you lose your properties, things are washed away. It makes no sense to build in the same location without building something that can withstand a similar event.
Thank you for that, Paul. It really doesn't make sense to keep putting up housing right next to the ocean, as we see in South Florida, of course, as we see the barrier islands. Galveston, Texas comes to mind. These places make no sense. A lot of people are saying that funding for adaptation should be tied to agreements that people in these areas that keep getting washed out don't get to keep collecting money from FEMA and then rebuilding every time. There has to be some degree of reasonableness to this. So we have a special guest here today, and that is Julie Johnston. And she teaches sustainability and she coaches teachers who want to bring sustainability into the classroom, which is very important. There's no aspect in our world that should be exempt from learning about climate change. She's also a climate reality leader, and she's a founder of Green Hearted Education, which strives to green the heart of education, which I think is beautiful. And I just love that. So I want to welcome you so much, Julie. It's great to have you on. So welcome. And Julie, I would love to hear your ideas on these adaptation opportunities.
Well, it's interesting what Paul was saying, because I just heard the other day that there's a consortium of insurance companies here in Canada that they're discussing what they're going to do. I mean, insurance companies are the litmus test, really, of what's going on in the world right now. But what they're talking about is not paying out an insurance payment unless the money goes towards making the house or business building more resilient, safer in the next big event. And I was so excited when I heard that, because I thought, whoa, that's going to wake people up if they weren't woken up by the hurricane or the whatever, the wildfire that flattened their whole town. That's going to wake people up. And so they have to talk about, is it going to cost more money? Well, that might be worth it to pay more for insurance if you know that when there's a climate change event, your insurance company is going to cover it, but what they're going to cover is you building to higher code, right? To safer code. There is a small town in Florida, of all places, it came to light because of Hurricane Ian. It's called Babcock Ranch. And if I understand correctly, it was founded by a former professional football player. And this whole town was built A, away from the coast, but B, to withstand the next big hurricane. And apparently, after Hurricane Ian went through, the only damage they had was a few little things were broken. So they had, for example, they'd planned their town so that the roads would flood, but the houses are all up higher than the roads, just as one example. All the power lines, everything else, all underground. So no one lost power. They have 70,000, is it 70,000? Is that possible? Solar panels. Anyway, enough solar energy and storage that they didn't lose their energy after Hurricane Ian went through. So I think we need to hold up examples like Babcock Ranch, so that, because so often adaptation is, that the whole notion that we have to make changes. It's a crisis of imagination. We can't imagine what's going to happen to us, and we can't imagine what we ought to do to deal with it. I do want to mention one of the things that Peter Carter has said to me several times is that we really need to be talking about adaptation measures that are also mitigation measures. I guess it's so that we're not wasting time. Like, let's adapt in ways that are also lowering our carbon emissions. And so perhaps we could talk about that here today. What would be some of those measures? What I want to do is talk about something that a child said to me today. I was working in a school garden with some children, kindergarten kids. And one of the girls said, "Why do we have to work in the garden?" Like, it was work, we were actually working, we were getting dirty and we were sweating because it's unseasonably warm here in British Columbia. And I turned to her and teachers are always thinking at so many different levels because what comes out of our mouth shouldn't be some of the other things that we're thinking, because what I was thinking was, "Hey kid, do you want to eat?" What I said was, it's because of something that we do 3 times a day and sometimes 4 or 5 or 6 times a day. And she couldn't figure it out. And I pointed to my mouth and she said, "Eat." And I said, "Exactly, because we have to learn how to grow our own food." And that's got to be one of the biggest adaptation measures we can take, is to teach kids how to grow their own food, but to also support the farming community, all the farmers, all the people into agriculture who have to make huge adaptations in how they're growing food in a changing climate. Huge changes for them. My heart goes out to them, and my stomach is so grateful for them.
Thank you so much for that example, Julie. That was really, I just love hearing stories like that. And if you ask me, we don't hear stories like that enough. And I really like Peter Carter's notion of tying adaptation and mitigation. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, and I'm thinking of Hurricane Harvey in Houston. One of the things that they did, which should have been done decades ago, is they built bioswales around the city. And like when you have these huge overpasses with freeways, instead of having concrete there, bioswales, which of course the plants help draw in CO2, so that's the mitigation factor, but also adaptation. When it rains, the rain actually has some place to go instead of just running off on concrete. So thank you. That's great. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul and hear what other ideas you may have for us.
Yes, so coincidentally, just before we started filming this show, I came across an article in Canada's national broadcaster, the CBC, and it was an interview with Canada's Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, and probably pronouncing that wrong, but he was talking about Canada's Climate Adaptability Plan, which is a large plan document that is supposed to be released just before COP27. And he did give some examples of things. And he said, yeah, there's people actually living right along the coast. And he gave some examples in Newfoundland, Port aux Basques. He said those houses that were on the rocks and washed out to sea should be built further inland. In fact, a lot of people that were in houses right along the coast, they want to stay in the town, but they just want to be a little bit further away and in higher ground. And I think it's going to come down to insurance companies, because people that have houses with too much exposure to the risks just won't be able to insure their houses. So when their houses are being rebuilt, they won't actually even be rebuilt in the same location, because there is no way that insurance could be given on such a house. The key to adaptability, I think, as well as mitigation, anything else, is education of people, because there's lots of people with lots of good ideas, but they have to recognize what the hazards are, and then they can start thinking about ways to deal with them. For example, when we first started getting some major heat waves, say in the last couple decades, there was a major heat wave in Chicago, and hundreds to thousands of people were killed. Such a heat wave, the next time the same type of heat wave hit the city, there were very, very few people killed, because people were more resilient. They had air-conditioned community centers and libraries that were advertised, so people could go there and cool down at night, even sleep there. There were checks done on older people living in apartment buildings without air conditioning to get them out. There were all these human responses at the local sort of community level to take people out of harm's way when such a hazard was occurring. So, in the example of Bangladesh and hurricanes or tropical storms causing storm surges, killing huge numbers of people, where they put up these large towers, which are concrete reinforced, so that community people can just go up into these towers when there's a hurricane coming. They don't have the means to get out of the area necessarily, but they can go up into these towers and survive the storm surges and the storms. So there's lots of different ideas and that people can use to become more resilient. With heat waves and working outside, there's technologies that I call them chill suits. You can imagine water-cooled clothing, or clothing that's cooled by something called a thermoelectric cooler powered by a battery, which will remove heat from the body when the humidity and temperature are too high for us to do it naturally. So there's lots of different ideas out there. We just have to make them a priority in our society.
So, Paul, something that you said reminded me that one of the major issues that's coming down the pike, probably already happening for many people in the world, is this notion of compounding climate change events. Is that the terminology? And
Yeah.
so it's, people are hit, let's say they're hit with wildfire, and then they're also dealing with heat wave at the same time. What we don't realize when we talk about adaptation, we have to be like adapting to so many different things, like so many possibilities piling on at once. We're still emitting greenhouse gases at ever increasing rates. And so things aren't getting better, they're getting worse. The worse they get, the more things are going to pile on. And so one of my thoughts is just that we have to, you talked about education, Paul, we have to educate people around how bad it could get, and therefore how hard we have to work at adaptation.
Yes, and I guess one of the weak points in these disasters seems to be the electrical power grid. So, give the example of Fiona, Hurricane Fiona, but also with, Hurricane Ian in the US. But I mean, Fiona went through, it was almost 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago. There's still over 3,000 people in Prince Edward Island without electrical power. This is like 2.5 weeks later. I remember years ago, when we had a major ice storm come across the US and up into Canada, it took down some of the main power lines, and there was power out for weeks. And this was in the winter, so people they struggled to stay warm. So one of the ways to deal with this is a problem, an inherent flaw in a centralized power grid. So going to renewable energy, where people can generate their electricity locally, makes a society or a town or city or whatever much, much more resilient. And you mentioned that great example of the town in Florida that were with the 70,000 with the solar panels, because solar panels and wind turbines have shown over and over again to be extremely resilient. When Japan was hit by the tsunami, which and caused the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, there were wind turbines that were still operating, providing power to lots of people in Japan. That was the only source of power in some regions, these wind turbines. So going to renewable power leads you to a much more distributed power grid. And if you have battery storage, you can be much more resilient, get the power up very quickly, and start getting things back to quote normal after a disaster. So yeah, it looks very bad for Canada and for PEI to have that many people, and that's a significant part of the population. But that's a huge number of people still without power, going on 2.5, 3 weeks after the storm.
Listening to the two of you, what comes to mind actually, so we're talking about adaptation and resilience of infrastructure and structures, but when I'm hearing you talk, it dawns on me, we also need to talk about resilience of humanity, of us, because this is going to require so much more from us. I mean, it's hard. Change is very difficult. We saw what happened with people just adjusting to wearing masks, during COVID. So I'm wondering if either of you, and maybe you, Julie, having been a teacher, if you have any ideas of how we can build some type of mental, psychological resilience in the people who are going to have to live through this.
Well, the word that I just wrote down was compassion. And we're dealing with so many things that are the antithesis of doing the right thing, of working together. Because building resilience for this isn't something that we can do by ourselves. We're going to have to work. It's like emergency preparedness, right? We do it as families and households. We do it as neighborhoods. We do it as whole communities. We do it as regions, as nations. But it's to get started, and it's also to always put those most vulnerable at the center of our deliberations, right? I still run across climate change deniers or climate emergency deniers all over the place, out and about or on social media, for example. And I wonder, like, where is their compassion for the people who are already being hit first and worst, who don't have the means to build resilience? They just don't have the wherewithal to build resilience. So I think compassion is going to be a big part of it. And then, yeah, I mean, at some point, the whole educational endeavor is going to have to start focusing on adapting. I mean, because they haven't focused on mitigating, right? So we're going to be clobbered, but they will soon enough all have to be working on adaptation. I mean, even if it's just, what are you going to do with all your kids who are on the sunny side of a school, right? Those classrooms are going to get so hot. So how are you going to adapt? What are you going to do? How will you get daylight in a classroom where you're drawing blinds? What's that going to look like? What sorts of changes do we have to make? Just some of them are really simple things. But I think if we keep the most vulnerable children, right? People with disabilities, people in poorer parts of the world, people in the poorer people within our own developed countries, right? If we can keep those people in our hearts, then I think it'll be easier.
Again, that's educating people. I mean, one of the reasons I think why people are less resilient now than they even were a few years ago is the total reliance on screens and smartphones. The power grid goes off, you can't charge your phone, you don't have a Wi-Fi signal, no phone signal. What do especially younger people today, what are they going to do to survive even a couple of days, right? They think that like the world has ended, they have no signal, they have no phone. Well, you could pick up a book and read it. I mean, the thing is they've lost a lot of the skills, the basic skills. Julie was talking about growing food, but what about how many young kids today know how to even change a tire on a car, or know how to change the oil, or do a basic thing like making having access to fresh water if the tap stopped working? Where are you going to go get your water? Or what sort of food can you eat? Everything is sort of made in society to take away our independence and our resilience. So we need to educate young kids, whether it's send them on a camping trip for a week without power into the bush somewhere. These are skills that people can be taught so that they can have a confidence that they can survive such a situation. Because if they don't have that, then panic ensues, and then it can be complete destabilization and stealing and looting and chaos, right? When everything that we expect is going to be there is suddenly not there for even a short period of time.
One of the great experiences I had as a child, and this was before Proposition 13 was enacted in California. This was when schools were well funded. All the kids in sixth grade got to go to sixth grade camp, and it was a big deal. And it was, I don't even know if we paid anything. If we did, it was highly nominal. Everyone could afford it, even the poorest. And we did just that. We went off into the woods of California, and we spent a week away, and we learned all about nature, and we learned about how the trees have the needles and they drop, and it's called ground cover, and it protects the soil underneath. And it was a great experience. And we need to invest in our youth. And I think bringing programs such as that back into education would do so much. We can afford it. It's just about how do we want to allocate our resources. So I love that idea. And I have to say, I really enjoyed this program. The idea of adaptation, it's kind of scary, but it's also exciting. It's something we have to do. And there are really neat opportunities. So I enjoyed this. And if you enjoyed it, I'm going to encourage you to hit the thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe to help us reach a wider audience so that we can work on saving the world, because that's what we're all about here at the Climate Emergency Forum. And we look forward to seeing you next time.